Okay, gentlemen, thanks for joining. And I'm wondering where we should start this, because in some senses, we could go back to the start of Syria's problems, say, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, when the British and the French really screwed them over in 1916, and then the imposition of the brutal French government during the Mandate period, and how that led into ultimately the Ba'athist Party when the Syrian independence came about after the Second World War. But then you go through this phase of the Assad family running Syria, and relations with the West going back and forth a bit. So we have George Bush putting Syria on the axis of evil in the year 2001 after the September 11th attacks. And then there's a kind of thawing of that in the early part of the Obama years before that seems to come crashing down around 2010 with renewed sanctions for Syria's support of terrorist groups, and supposedly it's seeking of weapons of mass destruction. And then in 2011, it all kicks off. So the thing that is really curious to me is, what are we seeing here in terms of this continued Western attitude to Syria? And if we bring Israel into the equation, are we seeing the Oded Yinon plan, as expressed in the Clean Break policy paper, playing out, or not that? So maybe I'll turn it over to you first, Adam, and say, could you maybe go through the origins of this conflict in the recent era, how we got to 2011, how we got to the breakdown from a relatively stable country into a mess?
Well, I would say as much that the civil war was started by the Arab uprising, which began with the Syrian revolution in March of 11, where you had the popular dissension between the Ba'athist regime under Bashar al-Assad, as you said, and the pro-democracy rallies, which led to the Arab Spring groups like the Free Syrian National the Syrian National Army, and they were all in opposition to Bashar al-Assad, who is considered the dictator of the country. But by doing so, the religious fundamentalists like Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and the Arabian Peninsula, groups of this nature, were basically persona non grata. And the militants inside the country were actually jailed. And there were thousands of these militants that, either came from Egypt, who were basically, there's something about Arab socialist governments like Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and Iran, is basically they're very critical, very harsh, aggressive to the ultra-Orthodox, or the Salafists, as they're known, Wahhabis. These are people who are basically illiterates, who go by the hadiths rather than the Quran and the translations thereof. And these are people who are a part of a Sunni branch, small Sunni branch, Wahhabis. A lot of these groups basically tend to fluctuate between these countries because they're not welcome, and they're either jailed in the under Egyptian law, under Syria, under Lebanon law, and they go focus around the countries and whatnot. A lot of these governments under Egypt and Syria, incidentally, fell under the Arab Spring uprisings. And what happened was that a lot of these Salafists that were jailed under Assad managed to escape the prisons under these revolutions, and created the Sunni and Shia civil wars that came out of the Syrian civil wars itself, Sunni and Shia battling each other. And it just so happened that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who took over Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who took over this small group that was left over from the Abu Musab al-Zarqawi group, which was the Wal Tahad al-Jihad group, which later became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Though they were decimated when Zarqawi was killed. And this small faction managed to navigate over to Syria, and they were arrested in Iraq later on. Baghdadi was arrested. They managed to emigrate to Syria under this civil war. And so they began to regroup. And this group would later become Al-Qaeda in Syria, then later on Al-Qaeda in Syria, which later broke off from the Al-Qaeda traditional group under Zawahiri and bin Laden. And so they became Islamic State and the Levant because they took over much of the country really fast. And what they did was they took over the oil wells in Damascus. This led to a growing faction between groups like the Tahrir al-Sham and the al-Nusra groups. And what they did was they tended to change their names, but then it became under one conglomerate. And that was Al-Qaeda in the Islamic State in Levant. which they took over a lot of these smaller Salafist groups and became as one. And they had a lot of power. I mean, they just took over a lot of northern and southern Syria. And there was, the Syrian armies that basically under Assad held fast. And then as well, in 2011, you had a CIA-led operation that was supported by Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel, which was Operation Timber Sycamore. And this was a proposal by General David Petraeus, where they would arm these groups, the smaller factions, not the Islamic State, because it would be too obvious. So they went under these other groups like al-Nusra and these groups like this, and they gave them training and funding and militant arms in the same fashion what we did with Afghanistan with Operation Cyclone. This was a little bit different, was that they wanted to overthrow the Assad government. And Assad managed to outlive the operation. It was ended by Trump in 2017. One of the few good things that Trump did. And basically, the war continued. But then here comes Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, because Baghdadi is killed, and now there's no emir for the Islamic State that was named right away. So Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, who was leading a group called the Hayat al-Tahrir group, which is at that time, a known terrorist group under the United States government. And actually, I think there was a $5 million or $2 million reward for the capture or the killing of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. And what happened was, fast forward to the current predicament, Jawlani managed to depose Bashar al-Assad because the government under him broke off. It just couldn't hold on anymore, and they basically left. And Bashar al-Assad announced this overnight, and a lot of people didn't see this coming. But people under him said they saw this coming months prior, and that the transnational government was weakening, and the government under Assad was weakening, and the transnational government, led by Hayat al-Tahrir group, took over, and Jawlani became the emir, or the unofficial leader. He self-professed himself as leader, and one of the first things he did was basically liquidate the Alawites and the Shia and the Sufis from places like Deir ez-Zor and, of course, the capital in Damascus. And what the United States basically did was take them off the terrorist watch list and the group, and basically just thumbed the nose in international law. And this guy just basically, in the first week, started slaughtering people. Christian churches were burned to the ground. And now we have a full-out war against the Shia minority, who are fleeing the country and to basically create more refugees in the process. And this created one of the biggest refugee crises in the Middle East currently, which was under the Civil War of 2011, flooded, countries like Italy and Germany and Finland and France with all these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Syrians, not to mention the hundreds of thousands in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, and just create a refugee crisis all throughout Europa. So now we're faced with another refugee crisis under the Jawlani administration, and that's where we're at right now, currently.
I'm interested really in getting to motive, Adam. So I suppose there's a couple of different themes, like whatever the extent of foreign influence in Syria is, there is this fissure in Syrian society between the religious and the more secular elements, which has always been there. And the Syrian Congress, going back to 1920, was an effort to build a secular state which incorporated the more religious elements in a way that they could be happy whilst not controlling everything. So you have a state that is beyond its religious influences. And it seems to be, perhaps through the French influence and the domineering way they ran the country, this hasn't held out over time. And it's led to an extensive amount of conflict between the religious and secular elements. And you see this in like the Homs massacre of 1982, where 25,000 people are slaughtered by Bashar al-Assad's father there because of the Islamist terror that was going on in response to that. He just flattens 2/3 of a city and the civilians in it. So there are these fissures in Syrian society, but you also have external influence coming in from the Gulf states and from the United States, and no doubt Israel too. So I'm wondering, Adam, how much do you see the initial outbreak, this initial uprising in 2011, as being an organic movement from Syrian people based on a dissatisfaction with the Assad regime, which was no doubt oppressive in lots of ways, in terms of free and fair elections, in terms of access to the internet. I'm sure in terms of economic opportunities too, Syrians might have felt they could have done better, but the country was by no means a basket case either. So how much do you see it as an organic uprising, or how much do you see it as a foreign influence operation where perhaps that was going on right from the first day then?
There is a dual-edged sword here regarding the division of Syria, what's going on currently in Syria, Lebanon, and of course with the looming war in Iran. There is a nationalist identity that is coming from the West, but in terms of the Gulf, as you say, it's a religious division war. What we're talking about is that the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, are of the Sunni branch, or the, like I said, the Wahhabi-led type of ideology that's permeate in these areas. And then you have the Shia minority, which is predominant in Iran. And of course, by extension, Syria and Lebanon. That's between the groups like Hezbollah, for example, or Hamas. Hamas is a Sunni branch, but they work with Iran. Iran funds them because they are basically at odds with the Israeli Likud party or the Israeli nationalists, the religious Zionists of this nature. The relations with Saudi Arabia and Syria go back to the 40s, but if you want to keep it recent, in the year 2000s, Assad, who succeeded his father, had visited Saudi Arabia way back under the tutelage of King Fahd. This actually was a big meeting because not only was it seen as a shocking nature of the branches between Sunni and Shia, but it also said that they're willing to modernize relations for the future. And after the takeover of the kingdom by the Salman family, Salman wanted to reform with the West and not so much under the Shia branches. There's a lot going on here, and I don't want to lose yourself in a lot of this history. But with the Arab uprising, which was supported by Saudi Arabia, and this was no shock here, it basically wanted to normalize future relations with the United States, because the United States can bring about. After 9/11, let me just say this. After 9/11, there was a lot of pressure on the Saudi government. And because of their involvement with the hijackers inside the United States, like Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, the U.S. government after 9/11 pressured Saudi Arabia. And the Bush administration made it clear to King Fahd that you are to modernize, because for decades Saudi Arabia has always been saying we're going to reform the country, we're going to reform and keep the religious edicts under power, and Ibn Baz will keep them, the leader, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, will keep them under wraps, and they never could because that's how much power they had. So after 9/11, basically they had to, and this later on transferred over to the new kingdom, which is under King Salman, who took over the country by force. I think it was the Turkey family that was supposed to take over. Don't quote me, but I think it's one of the 7 sons. Turkey was going to take over the country, but it was under his heritage. But then Salman took over by blackmail and by forcing these people, and just having the Revolutionary Guard and the General Intelligence Directorate, the Mahabeth in Arabic, to basically kidnap some of these people and basically threaten them with either jail or murder. And they all sided with Salman. He took over the country. This led to a new version of what was going to reshape the Middle East. Now, you brought up the Oded Yunnan plan, headed by Israel, which was basically a fringe plan, but it turned out to be most of it true, in that they were going to take over or fraction the Middle East, countries like Egypt, Jordan, the West Bank, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria. As you could see, most of these countries, if not all of them, are Shia countries. They want nothing to do with the Gulf because the Gulf is easy. The Shia countries are basically westernized. Their militaries are better. They're more literate. By fractioning these countries, and this is the mind of the Israeli government under the time under Yitzhak Rabin and Ariel Sharon, was that they considered more of them a threat, even though the Gulf countries, which created groups like the Abu Nidal organization, or the Al-Qaeda, or Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, and the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. These are the people that are creating terrorist groups that basically gave us international terrorism. Well, Israel said, no, we'll not go to war with Gulf. We'll go to war with the Shia countries because they're more of a threat to Israel than those groups are because they're illiterate. What are they going to do? And it's not so much that Al Qaeda and the Islamic State never attack Israel because Israel is such a smaller country, the security is stronger. It's easy to attack the West in the name of Israel. And so the U.S. saw a benefit to this. And what this led to was, like I said, with the Arab Spring in 2011. And now you have these countries that never had a Salafist problem, like Libya, Syria, Lebanon. Now these countries are led by, Libya is under a civil war of their own, where they, Muammar Gaddafi didn't have an Al Qaeda problem. Now there's slave trades in Libya right now ongoing, and Syria is led by a terrorist, like Jolani's a terrorist. So this actually benefits not just Saudi Arabia from the religious side, but also from Israel and the West in terms of the demographics and keeping the terrorist threat alive, where the military industrial complex and the Pentagon will always have that forever war because they'll go to war with Jelani later on. I mean, this is what happens when, people that are supported by the West, they run out, they have a shelf life of 5 to 7 years, and, then they're the enemy. We saw this with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And this is what's going to happen in the future, is that you're creating terrorist groups by bombing the Shia countries, and then you're going to have the unthinkable happen. We wouldn't see this in the past. You're going to have these Salafists and the Shia minority working together and creating the revision of the caliphate, the Islamic caliphate against the West. And you have to wonder, was this all a plan by the Israeli government and the U.S. government? Well, it's not so much of a fringe threat anymore when you read the Oded Yanam plan and the Project for New American Century. When you look at these foreign policy goals of neoconservatives and these ghouls in Saudi Arabia, these are all monsters and murderers. They all have something in common, which is the elimination of any type of socialist-led governments in the Shia government, and always to keep the Salafists in working order. It's not so much that they can't beat these groups; they can, but they don't want to because they serve as a useful proxy, a useful enemy later on for the private benefactors and the foreign-led governments and international governments, and as well as domestic governments and the private military-industrial complex and private military firms, Raytheon, Boeing. They continue to make the missiles and bombs as long as the millions and millions of dollars go into these benefactors and privateers, as well as U.S. governments. And there's so much going on.
Okay, one thing I'd like to pick up on that you said there, Adam. James, do you have anything you'd like to come in with?
Well, you're making me think of, going back to obviously 9/11 and what happened after the Wesley Clark statement, famous 7 countries in 5 years, which all fits in, doesn't it? It's, a lot of people think that is the original Yinon plan in action, really. What is the purpose? Is it just to break these countries up and cause chaos? That's the part that I find puzzling, really. What was the objective of the, attacking the 7 countries? What's the purpose of destabilizing these countries?
Well, I suppose there's a purpose for Israel and a purpose for the United States, and the Elam plan was the purpose for Israel is to not have strong Arab countries around that can resist it. It's much better to balkanize these states so they can't support groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and any kind of Palestinian resistance. And then the Oded Yalam plan is kind of action through the clean break policy document, the 1996 policy document, which talks about Israel making a clean break from its efforts to cede land for peace to the Palestinians and rather take a more bold and assertive stance on that. And that then, I suppose, becomes the project for a new American century. So you could certainly take the view that the United States is acting on behalf of Israel due to the high number of Zionist ideology and the impact of groups like AIPAC acting out their interest. Now, what the strategic interest for the United States is to support things like Timber Sycamore is kind of harder to say. You can say it in Afghanistan, right? That the Operation Cyclone, the supporting of the Mujahideen, was very directly to bring down the Soviet Empire, which you might think is a stupid thing to do, but you could see how it's in the geostrategic goals of the US ruling class. But what exactly they're doing in Syria, how they expect to benefit from that, or how they expected to benefit from the Iraq war, outside an explanation that involves Israel, it's very hard to say. What do you think, Adam?
There's way too much in terms of benefit for regards to foreign policy advisors, planners, and the military, and as well as the religious fundamentalists that are basically grown out of this violent uprisings that we're seeing. And this is another thing, too, I didn't mention before, was that the issue of Gaza is going to actually put on the map what I think is going to happen in the future, the alignment between the factions of the Sunni and Shia branches and the extremist kind, because of the simple fact that Israel is needlessly and unjustifiably just slaughtering. I've never seen, Richard, in my lifetime. I think the only time I saw any type of egregious war crimes of this magnitude was Serbia and Yugoslavia. And this is not even a war. It's because it's a one-sided conflict at this point. The Palestinians don't have a military. And they're leaning on groups like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas as the only line of defense. And in doing so, Israel is just basically just slaughtering everybody. I mean, right down to the foundations of these homes. It's just when you look at Rafah, for God knows how long, there's no more city. It's just nothing is left, and you would never thought this was going to happen. And it's like I have personal arguments with people about, and these are educated people who are defending this. And I'm saying, do you realize what's going to happen? Do you think people are going to have short-term memories and just forget about what's going on? You are basically creating a vacuum for Islamists to exist. And even, 9/11 was a precursor to the Gulf War, or the station of military in Mecca and Medina, or as Bin Laden basically warned us, or what's going to happen. And I'm not saying he's right, but now with this issue of Gaza and what's happening in Libya, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Lebanon, and now the West Bank, it's creating this what I think is going to happen is this huge and disastrous future of the Middle East. And right in the epicenter is going to be, of course, the United States and their coalition partners, which is Great Britain, Australia, Canada, Germany, Spain, and a war with Iran, and by proxy, Syria and Lebanon. And that's the reason why they wanted to break Syria in the middle, because Syria is in the middle between Lebanon in the west, and of course Iran in the east. You break that middle, you don't have a chain between Hezbollah in Lebanon to Iran. And I think it's, this is, easy to discern what the foreign policy plan, the long-term plans are. Is basically, as you said, Richard, and James said himself just, minutes ago, to destabilize the entire region, install these puppet governments that are loyal to the West, loyal to Israel, and Israel gets to expand its borders for the Great Israel Project, which they announced overall. I mean, it's not a fringe conspiracy at all. It's not anti-Semitic to say it. They're outright saying it. In fact, Netanyahu, who is a war criminal by any means, he's warranted by the international courts, isn't saying it outright. And it's not somebody, he's a monster, but it's the people under him I fear the most, just like with Trump. Trump is an illiterate, but under him are even worse, religious fundamentalists, young people. Same thing in Israel. People like Ben Gvir, who's a part of the religious Zionist party, that actually believe in the expansion of Israel's borders into Saudi Arabia and even further into Syria. And this is basically going to create, the Greater Israel Project. And these people actually say out loud what Netanyahu is always thinking, and he doesn't say out loud, is that we have to kill as many Muslims as possible in order for this to happen. He's not alone. Bezalel Smotrich, the former finance minister of Israel, part of the religious Zionist, the Oded Yehud party, which basically are just, right-wing fanatics. And these are the people that adhere to the ideology of a notorious Israeli terrorist, who they deemed as a terrorist, and Rabbi Meir Kahane. And it just, these people who are just a minority just 10 years ago are now part of the Netanyahu government. And that's why you saw tens of thousands of people, Israeli, in December of 2022, when Netanyahu won for his sixth term as prime minister. They saw what was coming, and they said, we can't allow for this to happen. Well, it's happening right now. And yes, when this Gaza incursion ends, And there will be an end to this. Netanyahu will step down. And it's the people under him that I really fear, because these are the people that want to implement the Greater Israel Project. And there is a small section, and I'm going to go a little bit fringe here, but it's not really fringe anymore, if you know what I mean. Because there's a small subsection that exists also in American, the Conservative Party, of these really religious radical Jews who basically want to see the third temple built on top of the Dome of the Rock and basically bring about the end of the world, which is basically the Mashiach comes and destroys all the non-Jews. Well, guess what? There is a small subsection of the Conservative Party that hate Jews. And these are people like J.D. Vance and, the people from the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute. And these are all young people that are coming out of these very radical mindset that see Israel as a problem for everything. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a faction, a divisive faction in the Conservative Party that Israel is currently creating. I made a post on Twitter, and I'll stop here recently, is that I said, Israel, it seems to me, is making an enemy for the world to say, look, we're just going to kill people. We don't care, right? The government. I'm not talking about the people. I'm talking about the government. In the hopes of having the world to hate them enough. And where the small subsection basically thinks that in order, with one day the United States, if this small subsection of conservatives become a real power and they see a dissociation from Israel as a benefit for the United States, if that ever happens, there's a project that I know you're aware of, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, called the Samson Option, where it was related to nuclear scientists and foreign policy advisors that if the United States were to basically disassociate from Israel, or that the Arab world were to, go to war with Israel, we're talking about the Gulf and, Iran and Lebanon, Syria, where they would just nuke the entire Middle East and destroy most of Europa, most southern Russia, and of course, Israel no longer, because the Samson Option thinks to this: if we can't have a country, you can't have a world. And that's what the whole Samson Option was about. Well, by proxy, guess where a lot of those nuclear missiles are pointing at? The United States. Why? Because if the United States disassociates from Israel, well, we'll destroy them too. Because like I said, if they can't have a country, you can't have a world. Now, years ago, I would be considered anti-Semitic for bringing this up. But I brought it up the other day, made a post about it on Twitter. I said, is it any more crazy to think about this? Because there is a small subsection in Israel that wants this to happen. And it just so happened 2 years ago, people forget, that there was I forgot the name of the person. He was he was not part of the government. He was part of a subsection of the government that basically brought up the idea of nuking Gaza. I don't know if you remember that, but that was I'm like, wow, they're even thinking about it. I don't know, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, this actually occurred to me, right? Like my series on Israel is called Ziontology, which on the one hand, it's ontology, a look at the foundations of Zionism, but on the other, it's a play on the term Scientology. Okay, and saying that really Zionism is a kind of cult, like Scientology. And I think one of the moments that sunk into my head was I saw years ago Abby Martin interviewing a guy who was an expert on Scientology. And I think Abby asked the question of like, well, it's not like as bad as Jonestown, right? It's not like Jim Jones in there because not everyone's died in a suicide pact, right? And he said, oh, yeah, but I'm sort of paraphrasing how she asked the question now, right? But the guy pointed out it's not over yet either. And that could be the way Scientology ends. It could end in a giant suicide pact, like, or in some egregious act of mass violence, mass killing, because they're just as crazy. And you could say that about, I guess you could say it about nation states in general. If any of them were facing an existential threat, they would let loose the nukes and take the world out. Like I think Putin remarked that he didn't foresee a world without Russia in it, for example, but it's not really likely that there is going to be a world without Russia in it. That would be quite a substantial thing. But yeah, I could definitely see it that as if the court of Zionism, if that ship sinks one day, it could go out in a kind of Jonestown massacre style.
You're making me think about something that Sheldon Adelson said, Trump's donor, as I recall it. He said that, this is, and this indicates how long this threat against Iran's been rumbling on for, because he basically said, we should drop a nuke into some part of Iran where nobody lives. I don't think he really cared. And then say the next one lands on Tehran. This is how these people seem to think. As Adam was saying, I heard that threat of dropping nukes onto Gaza. I'm sure they'd love to do it, to be honest, although they don't need to, because they've dropped the equivalent of I don't know how many Hiroshimas. Rafah's completely flattened, as you say. I mean, what more can you do, really? Clearly, the aim is to totally ethnically cleanse the region. I mean, that's just obvious, right? I mean,
yes, completely obvious. Yeah.
It's remarkable that it's got to this stage that it's so obvious the world's still turning a blind eye to it. When I say the world, I mean the Western world, of course. I can't believe it's gone on and they've allowed it to get to this point. I just still find it remarkable.
The 20s has been a shocking decade, right? Like, I can't believe what happened with COVID happened, where the world got shut down. I just can't, I mean, I just couldn't take that in. It just reshaped my whole sense of what human beings were like and what they'd be prepared to tolerate. And with what's going on with Zionism now, I'm probably less shocked because I lived through that. But to see people looking at a blatant genocide, a blatant ethnic cleansing program, and I don't see this at all. It's like people will believe that black is white. Like Kemi Badenoch coming out today and defending the state of Israel for not letting sitting British MPs enter the country and saying, well, they have a right to keep these disreputable elements out of their country. Nation states have a right to deny access. Just hearing a lady who could be British Prime Minister selling out British politicians like that in favor of the Zionist state, it's incredible. It just the way people will turn their backs on any humanitarian impulse in this. It is shocking. It's utterly disturbing as to the nature of humanity, or the nature of a certain percentage of people in humanity at any rate.
The other thing I think with Palestine and particularly Gaza that gets overlooked, I think, by a lot of people, particularly sort of nationalist types, is they don't seem to see. The way I look at it is, besides the horrific humanitarian aspect to it, I see it as basically an experiment. I see it as, this is how you control a group of people. Originally, you just contain them and you surveil them. All these techniques, which of course, Israel is the world leaders in these technologies, they can be used on our societies and will be. And now we've reached a point where not only is this population being contained and surveilled, but it's now being exterminated in a very, efficient manner, if you like, using high technologies again. I just think, can not nobody, but can a lot of people, they just don't seem to see that this is a prospect facing us, because all of this stuff can be turned back on our own populations, including ultimately even extermination. I just think it's terrifying, really. And the fact that people have just, accepted it.
You were at a protest in your hometown today in England, weren't you? Yesterday, right. How did you get on yesterday? What was it like?
Well, it was well attended. I'm in Sheffield, so we don't get huge marches.
So just for the American audience, Sheffield is a steel town in the north of England.
Yeah, I mean
historically it was a steel town. I don't know how much goes on now.
No. We still manufacture steel,
right?
I believe. I'm not sure for how much longer. Yeah, it's what are we, the fourth largest city in England, I think. Quite a kind of left-wing kind of city. So, it's got a kind of working class base, I suppose. Now it's more of a university city, really. But basically, we went on march. There were probably, I don't know, I'd have to guess, but maybe a couple of thousand, maybe. I mean, these are small numbers, but as I say, the scale of the sort of demonstrations you get in a place like Sheffield are quite small.
Yeah, I'm quite impressed with 2,000 people turning up actually in Sheffield.
I might be exaggerating. I don't know. It's hard to,
it's very hard to judge. Yeah.
What I would say is that we walked for about 2 hours, and we're walking down quite broad streets, and I couldn't see the two ends of the march. So, I don't know how many that is, but certainly many hundreds.
Adam, what's your sense of New York, where you are in terms of the word on the street, the feel on the ground for people's sense of what's going on in the Middle East?
I would say currently it's been an overwhelming response. But right now, if I'm correct, the protests are not about Gaza, basically. They're about Trump's policies elsewhere. But it's been overwhelmingly pro-Gaza, and it has been for years. That I don't think that's ever going to change, to be honest with you. But the issue here is that Gaza is indeed at the forefront, but there's a lot of other things, economic disparity, which is, really just becoming a bigger problem here than ever before. Rent strikes and whatnot, things of this nature, and closing businesses under the, as you stated before, the COVID period, which hasn't stopped, by the way. People tend to forget that the policies under the COVID administrations of Trump and Biden were just completely disastrous for the city itself, and we're still reeling from it. I have to say that I'm a little bit surprised at the lack of any actual fighting or conflict with pro-Zionists and Gazans. That's only because the overwhelming response, thousands of people are Gaza supporters, and it's just like there's that small subsection of maybe 50 people who are pro-Zionists, and they're like the biggest big mouths. They tend to instigate. The Gaza protesters are there en masse, and majority of them are peaceful. Don't let the New York Times fool you. Is that they think, oh, there's a lot of these riots. If there was an actual riot from pro-Gazans, the city would be destroyed, because there's like thousands and thousands of them marching up in Times Square, and just like they could just destroy Times Square. Just businesses are, you've never been here, it's just like there's hundreds of businesses within like an 8-block radius, and it would be overrun. Well, that's not the case, because the issue is very pertinent. It's pertinent to human life about what's happening. And I just wish that I think tomorrow, from what I'm hearing, they're having another protest, and it's international. From what I heard, it's a pro-Gaza protest. It's going to be millions of people involved. I think that's what's currently going to happen in the future. And I think with the rate of violence as we see that's upscaling in Gaza, which is unheard of, it's just like how much worse can it get until you start reading about the 15 medical workers that were killed and assassinated one by one and then buried with their trucks. And then the IDF says, we made a mistake. A mistake would be spilled milk. These people methodically killed these people. It's not like they didn't know who they were, because with the Israeli military and the intelligence services, everything in Gaza is monitored, and everybody is known to the Israeli military itself. It's the reason why they put a military checkpoint, in every 150-yard radius, and that's why there's cameras everywhere. It's the most surveilled place on the face of the earth, and it's not like they didn't know these people. They knew. And that's why they killed them, because there wouldn't be any type of retribution. Who are they going to be held accountable to? The international criminal courts, like I said, they're not co-signers. The West, no, they're actually silenced. In fact, I'll end it here. We have one senator, and I made a video about this. He's in Florida. His name is Randy Fine. He basically laughs at pictures of dead Gaza children. He tells people that Palestinians are animals. Like, he comes right out and says this. It's one thing about the Democrats. They'll think this, but they won't say it. The Republicans will come right out and just say it. That's the one thing you got to give them a little bit more appreciation for, is their brutal honesty. But at the same time, it shows the mentality of these people that are supporting this, Zionist regime, that are madmen, just pure madmen.
Okay, gentlemen. Maybe any further final thoughts before we wrap up?
So, I'll just say this. I've been saying it in past videos before. In order for this to change, and I'm as Richard would know that I am as pessimistic as I am, but there has to be some optimism here, because what else are we doing this for? I would like to think that the small voices would, create a fire and then a bonfire. As Billy Joel would say, we didn't create the fire, and the fire gets higher and higher and whatever. And basically, what will happen is that Israel will force the people to basically come out against them and support a permanent ceasefire. And if this doesn't happen, if what I think is going to happen is this will degrade into a larger regional war, where Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, as I stated in videos past, where we'll have to go to war, and it will involve the United States, either from a false flag type of event or through pressure from the Israeli and Saudi lobby for the ideological and political differences that are involved in this conflict, involved in the foreign policies of these governments. And the worst case scenario is that we'll have a strategic war that will last probably more than 5 years, which will destroy what's left of the U.S. economy and force people to revolt against the government, which, I can understand and I would support because I'm anti-government. But at the same time, this will create division between the Democrats and Republicans, where the U.S. government will become involved through their, law enforcement that will become involved. And if COVID is any prophetic vision for the future, how many people will go along with this? Now, you don't have to believe me. You just have to read the comments on viral media, and not just what's going on outside, because what's going on outside, people are not as obvious, but on viral media, which is the secret thoughts of people, are basically coming out more and more obvious in their hatred for one another because they support this conflict or they're against this conflict, is that it will destroy the United States within, and will create this civil war that I see, not an all-out civil war, just, pockets of resistance. And at the same time, this will be a precursor of what's going to happen in the Middle East, which is basically the destruction of the Shia minority, and that the Gulf will reign supreme along with Israel. But it doesn't stop there, because Israel is going to look at the Gulf one day and say, well, they're Muslim too. And they'll be the odd man out. Sure enough, they don't got the military. They use us, the United States, as the military. And what's going to happen? Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, you think they're going to pose a threat to the United States and the coalition partners? No. And that leaves, just in case, Israel and the West. And of course, like I said, the fringe option, which ain't so fringe anymore, about what I think is almost a reality at this point, the way things are going, and that is the Sampson option, where basically the subsection that exists in the Conservative Party takes over and sees Israel as a problem and disassociates. And that leads whatever's left of the Middle East to basically get revenge on Israel. And Israel can't defeat these people because they never fought on their own. And they lost, I'll give you an example. They lost to Hezbollah in 2006 in Lebanon. They're going to basically say, well, we'll commit national suicide. And if we're committing suicide, we'll kill you along with it. And for those people who are basically saying, well, this is crazy talk, just listen to the words of Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and Joseph Struk. These are all people in the Israeli government. These are people that basically are in positions of power that want to see the destruction of the Islamic world. And if you think the Islamic world is just going to sit back and watch the destruction happen, well, I got another thing coming to you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Richard and James. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.